On February 24th, 2017, 28-year-old Shannon Graves sat on the couch watching TV with her boyfriend in her apartment in Youngstown, Ohio. Shannon changed the channel, and right away she could see that her boyfriend, who was a man in his early 30s named Arturo Novoa, looked annoyed by what she wanted to watch, so she flipped the channel to something else. Then Shannon glanced over at Arturo, but he still looked annoyed. Shannon sighed, trying her best to keep her cool. It was not that long ago that sitting on the couch with Arturo would have made for a relaxing evening at home. But now, every time the two were around each other, they just seemed to argue about everything, even meaningless stuff like what to watch on TV. Shannon put the remote down and then leaned back on the couch and didn't say anything. She hoped that maybe if she just sat there in silence, they could avoid a fight. But in reality, Shannon knew that this TV show she chose, or whatever little thing they ended up arguing about next, was actually just a symptom of a much bigger problem. Her and Arturo's relationship was clearly falling apart. The two of them met almost a year earlier at the club where Shannon had been working nights as a dancer while she went to classes during the day to earn her cosmetology degree. And despite their obvious differences, at first they had gotten along great. Shannon was outgoing and always seemed to be on the move, while Arturo was quiet and more reserved. But they thought their differences actually complemented each other really well. So, after dating for only a few months, Shannon and Arturo moved into an apartment together. And that's when things started to go bad. It was like right away, they just both stopped trusting each other. Arturo accused Shannon of still being into her ex-boyfriend, a guy she'd actually been living with before she met Arturo, and Shannon was convinced that Arturo had a thing for this woman who was always hanging around him when he would come to see Shannon at the club. But whether or not those things were true, Shannon knew her issues with the relationship ran deeper than just thinking Arturo might like some other girl. Shannon had always been someone who loved change. She just never wanted to feel stuck. And so to avoid that feeling, she would often do things like dye her long black hair green and blue, or she'd take much bigger steps, like she would occasionally just leave town for weeks at a time to go on an adventure by herself without telling anyone where she was. But living with Arturo had definitely made Shannon feel stuck. And over the last few months, that feeling had really worn her down. Back in the apartment, Shannon eventually just stood up from the couch and began to walk out of the room. But as she did, Arturo snapped at her for some reason, and then before long, the two of them were just yelling at each other. And the argument escalated, even though neither of them really knew what they were even fighting about. Until finally, Arturo said, maybe he should just leave for good. And then he stormed out. Shannon stood there in her apartment for a minute, trying to catch her breath and calm down. She was mad, but she also couldn't help but feel this sense of relief. If Arturo was gone, like really gone, she could now do anything she wanted. She could make a change. She could go someplace new. A few months earlier, Shannon had finally earned her cosmetology degree. She had worked really hard for it, and she was proud of herself. Some people had been surprised because they thought getting a degree sort of went against Shannon's need for constant change, but Shannon saw things differently. Her degree could open doors and give her a chance to work as a cosmetologist in different cities. Or maybe she could even become a highly sought-after makeup artist who would get to travel all over the world. But Arturo had never really supported her dreams, so she had kind of given up on them. Now, she could start putting her degree and her talents to work, and she would not have to do that in Youngstown, Ohio. And just thinking about the possibilities for the future got her really excited. Shannon walked to the bathroom, got undressed, and turned on the shower. In her mind, she would wash off all the bad stuff that had happened recently, and it would be like the first small step towards a fresh start. On June 22, 2017, so 4 months after Shannon and Arturo had their big fight, Detective Mike Lambert of the Youngstown Police Department looked up from his desk, and he saw a uniformed police officer standing there with a woman who looked very pale and worried. Detective Lambert asked how he could help. The woman said her name was Debbie DePaul, and she needed to file a missing persons report. She said that nobody had seen or talked to her younger half-sister, Shannon Graves, in 4 months. A confused look came across Lambert's face, and for a second he thought he must have misheard her. And so he asked her again, how long has it been since anybody talked to your half-sister? and Debbie repeated herself and said again it had been 4 months. This blew Lambert away. In all his time as a detective, he'd seen family and friends typically file missing persons report, if anything, too soon, like before they really needed to, not 4 months after the fact. In fact, in the majority of cases he'd worked, the supposed missing person had turned up before the cops could even launch a real search. So he really couldn't understand why Debbie, or anyone else close to Shannon, had waited this long to talk to the police. Lambert told the other officer he could leave, and he asked Debbie to take a seat and walk him through what was going on here. After the officer left, Debbie sat down and said she knew how strange it must sound that she had waited this long. But if Lambert knew her sister Shannon, it would make way more sense. She said that Shannon had a history of just sort of taking off and not talking to anyone for long periods of time. It was something she'd done since she was a teenager. And as difficult as it was to deal with that, Shannon's friends and family had sort of come to accept it about her. It was one of the things that made Shannon who she was. But now, they noticed that Shannon had not called on a couple of family birthdays, and she also hadn't checked in when her best friend had a baby, and that was not like Shannon at all. Even when she went away without telling anyone, she would always call on these important days. Detective Lambert didn't say this, but he knew 4 months might as well have been an eternity when it came to a missing persons case. If Shannon had really left town like her sister claimed she liked to do, well, Shannon could be anywhere in the world by now. But Lambert figured he would just start his investigation the same way he would if Shannon had only been missing for a few days. So he took down information about Shannon's physical appearance, her last known address, and the places she had worked. He also learned small details like Shannon's favorite color was pink, and she loved wearing friendship bracelets. And so after only speaking to Debbie for a few minutes, Detective Lambert had a pretty good picture of who Shannon was. But he had one more question. He asked Debbie if Shannon had a romantic partner. Debbie said yes, Shannon had a boyfriend, or at least she did the last time they had spoken. She had been living with a guy named Arturo Novoa, and Shannon had told Debbie that she and Arturo fought all the time. The following day, Detective Lambert sat down with Arturo in a small interview room at the station. Lambert had looked into Arturo the night before. He knew Arturo had a couple of minor run-ins with the police, but nothing big, and he had no record of violent crimes or anything like that. So Lambert really just hoped that Arturo knew where Shannon was, or at least had heard from her over the past 4 months, and also, if he hadn't, he hoped to get a good idea of what Arturo and Shannon's relationship had been like. But when Lambert asked Arturo when he'd last seen or talked to Shannon, Arturo seemed surprised by the question. He said he'd already told all this to Shannon's family when they'd called him like a month or so earlier. He said he and Shannon had broken up back in February. He admitted that things ended pretty badly, so they had not spoken to each other since. The last he'd heard, Shannon was living with some guy in Cleveland, which was over an hour away from Youngstown. Arturo didn't know the name of the man that Shannon was supposedly living with, so he really couldn't provide much more color than he already had. And so Lambert wrapped up their conversation soon after that, and then he reached out to Shannon's sister, Debbie, to see if she knew of any men other than Arturo that Shannon could possibly be with. Debbie said before Shannon had started dating Arturo, she'd been in a serious relationship with a man named John Scarata. Just hearing that name shocked Lambert, and it caused him to immediately begin planning his next move, because he knew John Scarata all too well. John had a substantial criminal history. In fact, he had done time in prison on drug charges, and Lambert knew that John had gotten out of prison right around the last time anyone had seen Shannon. After speaking to Debbie, Detective Lambert got to work right away tracking down John, and it would turn out he was not in Cleveland. He was in Youngstown, trying to get his life together after getting out of prison. The following day, when John Scarata walked into the interview room at the station, he greeted Detective Lambert like they were old friends. And when the detective brought up Shannon, John didn't seem surprised at all. He said he'd learned Shannon had disappeared not long after he'd gotten out of prison. So Lambert asked if he was worried about her. And John, in response to this, did something that Lambert did not see coming at all. John leaned forward in his chair and said yes, he was really worried. In fact, he was so worried, he'd started his own investigation. Lambert was so caught off guard by this that he didn't really know how to react. What did John mean he was doing his own investigation? But just then, John grabbed his phone out of his pocket, pulled up his photos, and showed them to Lambert. And Lambert saw multiple pictures of different cars that had been parked right outside of Shannon's apartment over the past few months. John had staked out the place, looking for Shannon or for anything or anyone that seemed out of the ordinary. Lambert felt a little conflicted. He believed if something bad had happened to Shannon, John had to be a major suspect here. But he couldn't deny that he did want to track down all of these cars John had photographed at Shannon's apartment. So ultimately, Lambert did get the license plate numbers of all the cars, and he told John to stop staking out Shannon's place and to just let the police do their jobs. John said he totally understood. He just wanted to find Shannon and make sure she was okay. Detective Lambert knew John had connections to the criminal world of Youngstown, Ohio, so there really was a chance that John thought he was the best person to find Shannon, a woman he claimed to still be in love with. But there was also a chance that John was just trying to send the police on some kind of wild goose chase to keep them off of his trail, because maybe he had something to do with what happened to Shannon. So, in the days following their meeting, Lambert and his team tried to get a clear picture of everywhere John had been since he'd gotten out of prison, and if he'd had any communication with Shannon near the time she'd supposedly disappeared. Police also questioned Shannon's friends, her family, and her coworkers at the nightclub, and they also followed up on all those cars John had photographed. But for Shannon's half-sister Debbie, the police were not moving fast enough. She now believed that she and her family had waited way too long to get the cops involved, and so she felt like she had to do something to make up for that. So, in late June, about a week after she had filed the missing persons report, Debbie knocked on the door of a house in Youngstown that looked pretty much like all the other houses around it, except for the sign in the window that advertised psychic readings. A woman with a soft smile opened the door and led Debbie down a hallway to a small dark room. The woman told Debbie she was a psychic medium, which meant she claimed to be able to communicate with spirits or the deceased, and then was able to relay their messages to the living. Debbie sat down at a table with the medium and described Shannon and talked about how she'd been missing for months. The medium closed her eyes and listened carefully, and after a moment, she told Debbie she could see something: a bridge. Now, this medium didn't know exactly which bridge this was, but she was sure it was not far away from here. And somehow, this bridge had to be connected to Shannon's disappearance. Debbie left the medium's house and immediately called a friend of hers and told her what the medium had said. And both women decided it was clear what they had to do next. They would have to search every bridge in Youngstown, Ohio. And so for the next couple of weeks, Debbie and her friend went around town visiting every bridge they could find. And it started to feel like a waste of time. That is, until one afternoon when Debbie and her friend approached a small bridge that neither of them had driven on before. As they stepped out of the car, they saw something laying on the ground near the base of one of the bridge's girders. When Debbie walked over to it and knelt down to get a better look, she almost started crying. Because there, laying on the ground, were saw blades, a rope, and a pink sock. Debbie and her friend took pictures of the objects and then drove straight to the police station. Debbie told Detective Lambert about the medium's vision and showed him the photos of what they'd found at the bridge. Lambert had learned from Debbie when they first met that Shannon's favorite color was pink, and that she loved wearing pink clothes. He couldn't just ignore saw blades and a rope being found out in the middle of nowhere next to a pink sock. So, the detective told Debbie that he and his team would look into it right away. But as Lambert headed out to this bridge, he started to feel like this case was getting away from him. He was already dealing with the missing woman's ex-boyfriend conducting his own investigation, and now he was following up on a lead that apparently came from a psychic medium. And Lambert still had no idea what had happened to Shannon. She really could just be in Cleveland or anywhere else, purposefully avoiding her friends and family. Or she could be the victim of a horrible crime. One way or the other, Lambert needed some piece of concrete evidence to point him in the right direction. And while he didn't want to rule anything out, He doubted that that piece of evidence was going to come from a psychic vision. About a month later, on the afternoon of July 29th, a woman was making Italian food at her house in a small town just a few miles from Youngstown. As she cooked, she looked down at the food she was making, and suddenly she got mad at herself. She realized she didn't have enough meat to make the meatballs she was planning to serve with this meal. She thought about taking a quick trip to the grocery store, but then she remembered something. So she called out to her husband in the next room and told him to keep an eye on the stove. She left the kitchen and walked down a set of old wooden steps into the basement. She passed by their washer and dryer and walked over to a white rectangle-shaped chest freezer that was standing up against the wall. Now, this woman knew there was meat inside this freezer, and she could use it to make her meatballs. But there was a problem. The freezer had a padlock on it. But the woman was undeterred. She grabbed a nearby screwdriver off a work table and used it to pry the entire metal latch that the lock was connected to off the freezer. And so now with the freezer unlocked, the woman opened it up, and immediately she began to scream. At about 5:30 that afternoon, 2 hours after that woman had looked inside the freezer, crime scene investigator Tony Marzullo walked down the stairs into the married couple's basement. Marzullo worked out of Youngstown, but he helped in the surrounding smaller towns when he was needed. And today, he'd gotten one of the strangest calls he'd ever received from police dispatch in one of those smaller towns. Marzullo put on his gloves and approached the freezer. The freezer door was still open, and he could see inside of the freezer was an orange plastic bucket with trash bags sticking out of it. Marzullo got closer and leaned over the freezer and looked inside of that bucket. And the instant he did, he reflexively put his hand over his mouth and tried to collect himself. Even the call from dispatch had not prepared him for this. Because in the bucket, Marzullo was looking at the top half of a frozen, severed human head. Marzullo looked down deeper into the freezer, and he saw the entire thing was basically filled with trash bags. And as he pulled out each of these bags and looked inside of them, he found human legs, human arms, and human hands. Marzullo had no idea who the victim was, but instinctively, he grabbed his phone and called Detective Lambert. Later that evening, Detective Lambert stood in the basement with Marzullo and a group of police officers and forensic technicians. Like Lambert had expected, the psychic vision and the objects found at that bridge had not given him any new leads in Shannon's case, and neither had any of the interviews Lambert had conducted to this point. Basically, the case had stalled. He had no idea where Shannon was or what happened to her. But now, as he stood over the freezer, he had a sinking feeling that the body he was looking at could be hers. Now, they would need to run some tests to officially identify the body, but Marzullo was very confident they could do that quickly. Forensic techs would allow the severed hands they'd found to defrost. Then they would use a saline solution to rehydrate the fingers on those hands, which would allow them to pull clean fingerprints. While Lambert waited for those results, he interviewed the married couple who lived at the house to try to figure out how a dismembered body had wound up in their basement. The couple proved to be extremely cooperative. They said that freezer was not theirs. A friend had asked to store it in their house because the electricity in his house had been cut off, and he didn't want the meat in the freezer to go bad. When their friend had brought it over, they did think it was odd that the freezer had a padlock on it, but they'd assumed the freezer door just didn't stay shut on its own, so their friend must have locked it just to make sure the meat inside stayed frozen. The woman went on to tell Lambert that the only reason she had broken into the freezer is because she really wanted to make meatballs. Lambert thought the story was definitely strange, but none of it sounded untrue. So he asked who was this friend who gave them the freezer. They said his name was Anthony Gonzalez, but he was trying to become a hip-hop star, so sometimes he went by the name Tony G. That night, Lambert began his search for Anthony Gonzalez, aka Tony G. But despite it seeming like a pretty common name, he could not find a single Anthony Gonzalez living in Youngstown. And before Lambert could expand his search for Anthony to nearby towns, he got a call from Marzullo. Marzullo told him the lab had successfully pulled fingerprints from the now defrosted hands they'd found, and they were able to officially identify the victim. The body in the freezer was Shannon Graves. Now that police had finally found Shannon's body, and this had become a homicide investigation, news of the grisly discovery in the basement spread across Youngstown. And in the days following the discovery, Detective Lambert got an unexpected visitor at the station. Shannon's ex-boyfriend, John, had returned. John had heard about Shannon's body, and he admitted right off the bat to Detective Lambert that despite what he'd promised him, he said he had not actually given up his own investigation into Shannon's case. And in fact, now he had discovered something huge. John heard from a friend of his about a house party that had taken place a few months earlier. And at this house party, a man named Andrew Herman had been burning some of Shannon's stuff in a huge bonfire. With help from John, Detective Lambert and several other investigators found their way to the house where this party had taken place. And as soon as they got out of their cars, they could see the remnants of a bonfire in the front yard. There was a big pit filled with ashes and big pieces of wood around it that looked like they'd been used for seating. Lambert and a crime scene investigator walked across the dying grass in the front yard. They put on their gloves and began sifting through the large pile of ashes. And they found what looked like charred clothing and some burned pieces of plastic. But to their utter shock, it looked like one object had survived the fire and remained almost perfectly preserved. And as Lambert bent down and pulled this object out of the ashes, he almost couldn't believe it. Because of all the possible things he could have found, this was like the perfect clue. The object was a friendship bracelet with small plastic beads strung on it that spelled out Shannon. There was no doubt that John had been right. Somebody had been burning Shannon's things. Investigators headed back to the station with this new piece of evidence, and Lambert set up a meeting with Andrew Herman, the man John said had been burning Shannon's things. But John warned Lambert to watch out, because Andrew was a total psychopath. A guy who was into black magic and who worshipped the serial killer cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. On August 7th, 2017, so about a week and a half after the discovery of Shannon's body, Detective Lambert led Andrew into an interview room. And Lambert had to admit that Andrew was not anything like what he'd expected. Andrew wore a well-fitted suit and tie, and his hair was short and neatly combed. He looked way more like a guy who worked at a bank than somebody who was into black magic and serial killers. But Lambert knew the way this guy was dressing didn't prove anything, one way or another. Detective Lambert told Andrew right away that they had gone to the site of the house party and discovered a friendship bracelet inside of a fire pit that they were sure belonged to Shannon Graves, and that they'd heard Andrew was the one trying to burn it. Andrew nodded and said, yep, the bracelet was Shannon's, and he was trying to burn it. And he also admitted that he and a couple other people had also burned some of Shannon's other things at that party. Lambert just looked at him and said it seemed very suspicious that they had burned the belongings of a woman who'd recently been found brutally murdered. But Andrew did not flinch. In a perfectly calm voice, he said they had burned the stuff as a favor for a friend, Anthony Gonzalez. Now, Detective Lambert did not react to what he was hearing, but inside, after hearing that name, he felt like he was about to lock up this investigation. Because he was now able to connect Anthony, aka Tony G, the man who'd brought the freezer to the married couple's basement, directly to the bonfire that had been used to get rid of Shannon's personal belongings. So Lambert asked why his friend, Anthony, had wanted to burn Shannon's stuff in the first place. Andrew sat there in silence for a minute, and then he began to speak. And when he did, without ever losing his cool, he told a story that was even gorier and more disturbing than any story Detective Lambert had ever heard in his life. And by the time Andrew stopped telling this story, Lambert knew exactly what had happened to Shannon Graves. Based on information from Andrew, evidence found in the basement freezer, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Shannon on February 24th, 2017, and the following days. The killer walked through Shannon's apartment, breathing heavily and clutching a hammer in their hand. They could hear the shower running, so they headed for the bathroom. Once there, they opened the door and stepped inside. Shannon shouted something and pulled back the shower curtain, but before she could even figure out what was happening, the killer raised the hammer and slammed it into the top of her head. Shannon's body collapsed in the shower, and blood began to run into the drain. As for the killer, they continued to swing the hammer over and over again into Shannon's head. Her body twitched and then eventually stopped moving. She was dead in the shower. The killer turned off the water and just stood there for a second, staring down at what they'd done. And for the first time, they realized that killing Shannon was actually just the beginning. Now they had to get rid of her body. The killer rushed to the kitchen, found trash bags, and came right back. They opened up a bathroom cabinet, grabbed an electric razor, and turned it on. Then they leaned into the shower and shaved Shannon's head, believing this would help disguise her identity. When they were finished, the killer put the razor back, opened one of the trash bags, and awkwardly pulled Shannon's body out of the shower onto the bathroom floor. They tried to stuff Shannon into the trash bag, but quickly realized that was never going to work. So they tried to wrap the trash bag around her, but that failed too. The bag just wasn't big enough. The killer started to panic. They knew they had not thought this through. So they grabbed their phone and called their girlfriend. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The killer opened it and quickly led their girlfriend into the bathroom and showed her Shannon's body. The girlfriend did her best to stay calm. She said after dark, they could move Shannon's body to her place and figure out what to do with it from there. So the killer and their girlfriend spent a couple of hours in Shannon's apartment just kind of waiting around with Shannon's dead body only a few feet away. Not long after sunset, the killer and the girlfriend grabbed Shannon's clothes off the bathroom floor, they took her purse, and then did their best to wrap Shannon's body up in trash bags. Then they carried her body and her belongings out into the darkness and put everything into the trunk of the girlfriend's car. They drove to the girlfriend's house and brought Shannon's body inside and laid it in the bathtub. Then the killer called the one friend they thought could help. And later that night, that friend arrived with a fully formed plan and a machete. The killer, the girlfriend, and the friend of the killer spent the entire night dismembering Shannon's body. At some point, the friend told the killer to order sulfuric acid online and to set up a delivery at a bulk store nearby. In the meantime, the friend gathered up all of Shannon's stuff the group had in their possession and went to a house party, where they knew there was going to be a big bonfire, and they burned everything. Not long after that, the sulfuric acid arrived at the bulk store. Killer picked it up, and the three of them covered the now dismembered body parts in the sulfuric acid, hoping to melt Shannon's skin down to the bone. But they soon discovered a problem. In an effort to save money, the killer had bought off-brand sulfuric acid, and it just was not doing the trick. Large parts of Shannon's body were disintegrating in the acid, but not all of it was. So the friend took the machete and started hacking away even more at Shannon's body, while the killer went out and bought a chest freezer. And eventually, the three of them were able to get Shannon's body parts into trash bags and a bucket, and they crammed all of that into the freezer and locked it. And at that point, the killer's friend, who made a point of studying serial killers, believed they had completely covered their tracks. Andrew Herman, the man who supposedly worshipped Jeffrey Dahmer, oversaw the disposal of Shannon's body and her belongings. And his friend, Anthony Gonzalez, who also went by his hip-hop name Tony G, murdered Shannon. But it would turn out Anthony Gonzalez and Tony G, those two names, were both aliases. Anthony, aka Tony G, was actually Shannon's boyfriend, Arturo Novoa. On the night that he and Shannon had fought and he stormed out, Arturo did not leave for good. Instead, he came back, grabbed a hammer, and killed Shannon. But Arturo had not thought the murder through. So after it was done, he called his other girlfriend, the woman who Shannon had seen him hanging around with at the nightclub, for help. This girlfriend, who knew Arturo by his alias, Anthony Gonzalez, was very devoted to him, and was willing to do whatever it took to protect him, which is why she was willing to help dispose of Shannon's body. Police had considered Arturo a suspect, and when they interviewed him after the missing persons report was filed, Arturo worried they would start closing in. So he had taken the freezer with Shannon's body in it to the house of a married couple he knew. He told them he had no electricity at his place and asked them to store the freezer so the meat wouldn't go bad, and they agreed. After the discovery of Shannon's body in their basement, police had begun to look for Anthony Gonzalez, which the married couple believed was their friend's real name who owned the freezer. But it was when the couple showed the police a picture of Anthony that the police knew they were onto something, because they could tell the photo was not of Anthony. The photo was of Arturo. And finally, Shannon's ex-boyfriend, John, who had his own investigation, helped Detective Lambert solidify his case. When John led Lambert to the remnants of the bonfire and Shannon's friendship bracelet, it allowed Lambert to bring in Andrew for questioning, because that's who John said was burning all the stuff. And Andrew, when he was interviewed, just told Detective Lambert all about the horrors that had taken place from the moment Arturo killed Shannon until the moment the freezer ended up in the married couple's basement. Arturo was ultimately sentenced to 48 years to life in prison. His girlfriend was sentenced to 18 years for her role in the crime, and Andrew was sentenced to 12 years. In 1984, 19-year-old Timothy Molnar was living at home with his parents in Daytona Beach, Florida, while going to school for aeronautical mathematics. On January 24th, Timothy gets up and begins his day just like every other day of the work week, by going downstairs, having a bite to eat, and then taking his younger brother Frank to school. Once he dropped Frank off, he drove across town to his university where he had class, but as soon as he parked, he realized he had forgotten his bike, and that was something he brought with him everywhere. And so before class started, he went back home, he got his bike, put it in his car, turned around and headed out, and his mother would step outside and see him trailing away down the road, and that was the last time she, or anybody in their family for that matter, saw him alive. That night when Tim didn't come home, his family called the police. The police asked them, is there any reason he would want to run away? Is he in trouble? Is there anything going on? And his family's like, no, he's a straight-A student. He's got lots of friends. He's super happy. He's well-adjusted. He's on a great career path. There's nothing in his life to indicate that he would want to run away or that he's in trouble. I know he doesn't drink or do drugs. There's really nothing. So the police begin their investigation, and they start by looking at the family's credit card bills because they knew Tim had a credit card that was connected to the family account. And they found there had been a charge placed the same day he had gone missing in a gas station about 150 miles away. And so the police go out to this gas station and they find someone that had been there when Tim was there, and he was able to describe exactly what he looked like, what his car looked like. And the police ask him, was Tim alone? And the witness says, yeah, he was alone. He was acting totally normal. I saw him go into the store and then I saw him come back out again, and that was it. I don't know where he went after the gas station. So for the next couple of days, nothing really happened. There were no leads to operate on, and Tim wasn't getting in touch with them, so they just waited. Then on January 30th, so about a week after Tim has gone missing, Tim's family receives a letter from an auto impound company in Atlanta, Georgia. And the letter basically says, there is a car that's sitting in our lot that is registered to your house. You need to come out here and get it. And so the family goes to Atlanta, Georgia to inspect the car, and they walk up to it and there's nothing suspicious about it. There's no scratches on it. The tires are all fully inflated. They look inside and there's no sign of a struggle. There's no blood. There's no debris of any kind. But what they would find inside the car were Tim's credit cards, his wallet, his license, and other items suggesting that perhaps Tim is trying to ditch his old identity and start a new one. They also noticed a few very expensive items that they knew were always in his car were now missing. His car stereo, his toolbox, and his bike. Tim's family stayed in Atlanta for a couple of days thinking maybe Tim will return to this car, but after a couple of days it was clear that they weren't doing any good sitting there, so they went back to Florida. When they got back, they looked inside of Tim's room a little bit more closely and they discovered that none of his clothes had been taken. There was no suitcase taken. It was like he left with just the clothes on his back. They also checked his savings account and he had taken all the money out but left $10 in there. And the family believed that by leaving that $10, what he was really saying is, I'm going to come back someday. But he didn't come back, and they never ever heard about him again. It was like he just vanished. A decade after Tim went missing, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment about Timothy and his disappearance in hopes that the viewers would be able to give them some information about the case. And sure enough, a man named Stephen Cull, who was living in Wisconsin, called into the show and said, "Without a doubt, I know where Timothy is." He told them this story about how 10 years earlier he was walking around this forested area in Wisconsin when he came to a clearing in the middle of this forest, and he saw this lump in the middle of the ground. And he didn't know what it was. It was wintertime, so he couldn't tell if it was wood or an animal. And he walked up to it and he looked down and he realized it was this huge block of ice. And when he brushed the snow off the top, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Inside of this huge block of ice is the dead body of a young man. Cull would immediately call the police, who would show up. They would get the body out of the ice, but there was no identifying information on him, and he was very badly decomposed at this point, and so they had no way to identify him, and so he was buried and he was unclaimed. But from the second Steve saw that dead body in the ice, that image was seared into his mind. And so when the TV show Unsolved Mysteries put a picture of Tim up on the screen saying, "If you've seen this guy, let us know," Steven's like, "Oh my gosh, I recognize those clothes. That's the guy who was dead in the ice block." And so the police go to Wisconsin, they dig up the body that was inside of the ice, they do a DNA test, and sure enough, it's Tim Molnar. Even though Tim's body was almost completely skeletonized at this point, the coroner said there's no sign of trauma to his body. None. However, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. To this day, we have no idea how or why Tim wound up 1,200 miles away, frozen inside of a block of ice. Our next story is called The Ultimate Shock. One morning in early June of 2011, in the Russian city of Kazan, a 49-year-old Russian woman named Fagiliu Mukhamatsonov woke up feeling nauseous. Fagiliu had recently had some health problems, and her doctors had told her that she really needed to take it easy, don't do anything that really stressed her out or made her mad, basically just relax. And so, on that morning, this is exactly what Fagiliu decided to do. Instead of pushing through her nausea to go to work anyways that day, she decided she would call out from work and stay home and have some tea and try to just feel better. But a little while later, when Fagiliu was in the kitchen making tea, her husband, Fagili, he came in and asked her how she was doing, and she said, "You know what? I actually feel worse. My nausea has gotten worse, my chest hurts, and I'm starting to sweat. I'm gonna go lie down in the bedroom." But as Fagiliu walked across the kitchen to go lay down, her chest suddenly tightened tenfold, and she collapsed to the ground unconscious. Fagili rushed over to her and tried to wake her up, and when he couldn't, he rushed to the phone and dialed 112, which is Russia's emergency line, and he called for an ambulance. And then when the ambulance arrived, Fagiliu was not breathing. And by the time they got her to the hospital, she was declared dead. She had died from a heart attack. Fagili, who had been married to Fagiliu, his wife, for almost 30 years, was absolutely heartbroken. But he and his wife's religion encouraged people to have funerals within 24 hours of a loved one passing away. And so despite the fact that Fagili was basically despondent from all his grief, he pretty much immediately began calling relatives and friends and making preparations for Fagiliu's funeral, which would take place the next day. The next morning, Fagili woke up and put on his best suit, and then he joined his and his wife's family and friends at the funeral home for Fagiliu's funeral. When Fagili walked inside of the funeral home, he saw there were all these wooden chairs facing forward towards the front of the room, and at the front of the room, up on a table, was his wife's coffin, which was open and surrounded by all the flowers that Fagili had barely been able to buy with the little bit of money that he and his wife had. Fagili slowly made his way down the middle of the room to his wife's coffin, and the other people that were there saw him coming and got out of the way in respect to, the husband of the deceased. And so Fagili, he walks up and he looks down at his wife, who again, it's open casket so we can see her, and he was struck by her appearance. She just did not look right. Now, Fagili did not have enough money to embalm his wife, which means to preserve a dead body and make it look like it's very lifelike. And so instead, the people who worked in this funeral home had just applied heavy makeup to Fagiliu's face to try to make her appear more lifelike, but it really hadn't worked. To Fagili, it didn't even look like his wife. After all, Fagiliu never even wore makeup, and so to see her with heavy eyeliner and bright red lipstick was just totally bizarre. Behind Fagiliu's relatives were all assembled in the first row, beginning their prayers for the dead. And so Fagili, after taking a few more looks at his wife, he stepped back and joined the first row. And so as Fagili was standing there holding his mother's and brother's hand, he closed his eyes and did his best to focus on the words of the prayer, instead of on the grief he was feeling for his wife. And as he was doing that, his mother, who was on his right side, suddenly broke from the words of the prayer and let out this strange crying sound. And Fagili, he opened his eyes and looked over at his mother, expecting her to be collapsed on the ground from all the grief she was experiencing. But instead, he saw his mother was trembling and looking straight ahead. And so Fagili followed her gaze, and what he saw at the front of the room made Fagili want to faint. His wife, Fagiliu, was now sitting straight up in her coffin. She wasn't making a sound, but she was looking out at the crowd of people with her strange makeup on her face, just staring at them with wide eyes. And for a second, everybody in the funeral home noticed this and went totally quiet, and both Fagiliu and the mourners just stared at each other. And then Fagiliu began screaming, but at first it was like she couldn't make any sound, and it was this raspy, dry yell that was coming out of her mouth, but then it built and built until it was sort of like a bellow or a roar. And when this loud, deep, guttural sound began coming out of Fagiliu's mouth, the mourners in the room began screaming too. And suddenly, it was absolute chaos inside of this building. As funeral workers rushed to call emergency services, not knowing what else to do, Fagili, who also had been screaming after seeing his wife arise from the dead, he kind of snapped out of it and ran to his wife, and he embraced her, and when he did, Fagiliu went from screaming to silent. And she looked up at her husband with wide, scared eyes and began crying, and then she slumped forward into Fagili's arms. At this point, Fagili's family and Fagiliu's family saw what was happening, and they kind of snapped out of it too, and they rushed forward, and they helped Fagili lift Fagiliu out of her coffin, and they laid her down on the ground. And even though she wasn't moving, her eyes were open, and she was looking up at her family, just absolutely terrified, with all her makeup running from her tears. And then 12 minutes later, when Fagiliu finally was rushed to the hospital, she was declared dead again. It would turn out that when Fagiliu collapsed on her kitchen floor, she really did have a heart attack, but it didn't kill her. She was just unconscious, and her breathing was very shallow, and she wasn't moving, and nobody noticed. And so when Fagiliu kind of came to and woke up inside of her coffin at her funeral, she likely was okay, all things considered. She was, healthy enough to be alive. But when she looked around the room and saw she was at her own funeral and sitting in her coffin, the stress of that moment had given her another heart attack. And this one had been fatal. The next and final story of today's episode is called Headache. On the afternoon of May 25th, 2017, 42-year-old Nicole Gordon was laying on her couch in her home in Atlanta, Georgia, with an ice pack on her head. She had a blinding headache, one of the worst headaches she had ever had, and she was just unable to do anything else but lay on the couch. Nicole really had no idea why she had this terrible headache. The only thing she could think of was 3 weeks earlier, she had been in a minor car accident, and one of her car windows had broken, and some of the glass had cut her face, but she didn't think that would be enough to lead to this absolutely horrific headache that had not gone away for 3 weeks. But Nicole was a very tough woman, and even though she had thought about going to the hospital over these past 3 weeks to deal with whatever was causing this headache, she had told herself that, it's gotta be something minor, I just need to kind of tough it out here. And what toughing it out looked like was laying on the couch all day long, only getting up to eat and go to the bathroom, not going to work, and just sitting in the darkness with this ice pack, just hoping for this headache to go away. And so as Nicole was just laying there, she heard her back door open up. It was her boyfriend, Durante, coming in with groceries. He came inside and he put the groceries away, and then he came into the living room where she was, and he asked how she was doing. And she told him that the headache had not gone away yet, and would he mind going into the kitchen and getting her some ibuprofen, which are pain meds, as well as some water. And so Durante said, of course. He went in the kitchen, he got what she needed, he brought it back. She said thank you, she took the ibuprofen, and then she went back to just being totally miserable. But just a second later, Nicole and Durante heard a knock at the front door, and Durante, he walked over and kind of casually looked through the blinds to see if he could see who was at the front door, and he saw it was Nicole's best friend, Leisha. But instead of going to the door and opening it, Durante turned to Nicole and said, hey, it's Leisha, do you want me to get the door? And Nicole, she just kind of grunted and said, no, please just ignore her. Even though Nicole and Leisha were very close, Nicole knew that Leisha was very high energy. She had been calling and texting basically nonstop ever since Nicole had begun getting these headaches. Leisha just wanted to help and kind of be around and be a part of her recovery. But Nicole just couldn't deal with that super high energy right now. She could barely have a conversation without her head hurting even more. And she knew that Leisha and Durante didn't really get along too well. And so Nicole figured it would just be better for everybody if they pretended no one was home and Leisha just went on her merry way. But Leisha was very persistent and just continued knocking really loud on the front door. She began calling Nicole's phone, and so Nicole began reaching over and silencing her phone over and over again. And finally, Nicole looked over at Durante and just said, I don't need this. I'm going into my bedroom and I'm lying down. And so she grabbed her phone, she stood up off the couch, she could barely move, her head hurt so bad, and she walked, quietly past the front door, made her way into her bedroom, and she was about to lay down on the bed when she made the mistake of opening up her blinds just a little bit. Her room was on the front of the house as well, and she wanted to see if Leisha was still there. And when she opened those blinds, Leisha, who was outside, happened to be looking at Nicole's bedroom, and the two of them made eye contact, and Nicole's like, oh my god, she knows I'm here. And so Nicole, she just shuts the blinds, but now Leisha comes up to the window and she's yelling, Nicole, I know you're there, come on, let me in, I want to help you. But Nicole, she just could not deal with it, and so she laid down on her bed and just continued to totally ignore Leisha. Nicole knew that no matter how offended and upset Leisha was for this snub, she would get over it, because the two women had been friends for nearly 2 decades. 19 years earlier, they had been neighbors, and they had become friends really quickly, they had been pregnant at the same time, and they began raising their kids kind of like side by side. But in the last 5 years that Nicole and Durante had been together, Nicole and Leisha had kind of drifted apart because Leisha and Durante both had very strong personalities and they just kind of clashed. And Nicole and Durante had this kind of on-again, off-again relationship, and every time they were broken up, Leisha would come around and be totally unfiltered with Nicole about how much she didn't like Durante. But right now, Nicole could just not deal with Leisha, and so despite hearing her yelling for her to come outside, come on, I know you're in there, Nicole just rolled over on her bed with her ice pack on the side of her head, and she fell asleep. A few hours later, when Nicole woke up, Leisha was gone, as well as Durante. He didn't stick around for very long. He often would only come over just to check in, and then he'd go off and do his own thing. And so Nicole, who still had this blinding headache, she sat up, she got out of her bed, and she was only able to walk back out into the living room where she laid down on the couch and just went right back to sleep. Even though Nicole had had this headache for 3 weeks and it had not gotten any better, she really was convinced that taking enough ibuprofen and relaxing long enough would cause it to go away. But over the next couple of days, this headache, which was already like a 10 out of 10 on the pain scale to Nicole, somehow became like a 20 out of 10, and it got so bad that she couldn't even open her eyes. It was like horrific. And as this headache got so bad, her relationship with Durante started to sour. Durante didn't really believe that Nicole was actually in the amount of pain that she was in, and he kind of began acting like she was just being lazy. And this really upset Nicole because that wasn't true at all. She was just in blinding pain and couldn't do anything. Finally, in late June, so 5 weeks after Nicole's headaches had begun, and at this point, her headache had still not gone away, she was laying on the couch, like always, with the lights off, she's got the ice pack on her head, and she's just trying to get through the day when she hears the back door open, and it's Durante, and he comes in, he slams the back door, he doesn't even say hello, and he just storms into the living room and just looks down at her with a totally disapproving look. And Nicole, she kind of looked over at him, and when she saw that look on his face, she had just had it, and she said, "You know what? We're done." And immediately, Durante got so mad, and he's like, "How dare you? I've been taking care of you for the past 5 weeks, bringing you groceries, this and that." And Nicole, she had no energy to fight with him, and so she just let him rant and rave until finally he was done, and he walked out, and she was like, "Thank goodness." A few days later, on June 25th, Leisha was back at Nicole's house knocking on the door. Nicole had actually texted her to let her know that she had officially ended things with Durante, and so feel free to come over. There's not going to be any drama with him being here. And so Leisha had come back over. She was very excited to see Nicole and kind of get over the snafu of her being ignored. And when she knocked, Nicole did go up to the door and she opened it up. And Leisha, as soon as she saw Nicole, this is like the first time she's seeing her since Nicole's headaches had really begun, she knew something was definitely wrong with Nicole. Her entire apartment is totally dark, all the windows are covered up, and Nicole is squinting out at Leisha, kind of beckoning her to come inside. And Leisha's like, "Oh my gosh, like how bad is this headache?" And Nicole could barely make a sentence, and she just said, "Oh, it's so bad, it's so bad." And so Leisha came inside, and Nicole led her through the dark apartment to the kitchen and back. And Nicole, she sat down, and Leisha sat down opposite her. And Leisha began asking Nicole questions about her headache, about Durante, just kind of about her life. And quickly, Leisha realized that Nicole really wasn't making any sense. Her answers, even to the simplest questions like, "What did you eat today?" were in fragments and didn't really make any sense. And finally, Leisha said to Nicole, "Hey, this can't be a normal headache. This is something serious. You need to go to the hospital." And at this point, even though Nicole had been trying so hard to just kind of white knuckle her way through whatever was going on in hopes it would go away, she was starting to realize that there was something wrong here and she needed help from a doctor. And so Nicole agreed to go. And so Leisha would help Nicole up and kind of assist her out of the apartment and into Leisha's car, and Leisha would take her to the hospital. And when they got there, Leisha brought Nicole into the emergency room, and she explained to the nurses and doctors that Nicole had this terrible migraine. It started after she was in this minor car accident 5 weeks earlier. And so the doctors and nurses brought Nicole back to one of the rooms, and they began kind of treating her the way they would any other patient who had a serious headache. They asked her if she was hydrated. They asked what medication she was taking. They asked her what she was eating, how much sleep she was getting. They were just kind of going down the list of different things that could cause this headache, but nothing stood out as a red flag. Even the fact that she had been in this minor car accident and had some cuts on her face from the glass, that really wasn't enough for them to think, oh yeah, that would cause 5 weeks of a persistent migraine-like headache. They even looked at the cuts on her face to see if maybe they were infected or something, but they weren't. Basically, they had no idea what was causing this. But the doctors and nurses were very concerned because persistent, extreme pain in your head could be signs of a stroke or an aneurysm or something, both of which can be fatal. So they put Nicole through a series of imaging scans to get a look inside of her head to try to figure out what was going on. And after they finished all these scans, Nicole was brought back to her hospital room and she laid down on the bed. And even though she felt terrible still because of this headache, she at least felt like, okay, finally, these people are going to figure out what's wrong with me. They're going to give me medication. This headache's going to go away and I can get back to my normal life. But only a few minutes later, as Nicole is laying there trying to get comfortable, the door to her room suddenly burst open and a swarm of people came into the room looking very concerned. And in the middle of all these people was a guy wearing a suit, and he walked up to Nicole and he said he was a police detective, and he held up one of her scans and he pointed at it. But to understand what he was pointing at on her scan, we need to go back and look at what really happened on the day that Nicole got into that minor car accident. Back in early May of 2017, Nicole and Durante, who were still dating at this point, had just come back to Nicole's house after the two of them had been at a house party together. And Nicole was furious with Durante because at this house party, he had been openly flirting with another woman right in front of Nicole. And so Nicole, after going into her house, brought it up to Durante about how disrespectful that was. And Durante, instead of being apologetic or trying to defend himself or even lie about it, he actually just got really mad at Nicole and said, "You know what? Fine, I'm breaking up with you." And then he began going around her house, gathering up all of his things that he had left inside of her house. And Nicole, truthfully, was so mad that she didn't really care that he was putting on this show of taking his stuff and leaving her. And so after a few minutes of Durante angrily grabbing his stuff from inside the house, he headed outside to Nicole's car where he had some more things inside of her car. And so he went in the passenger seat, and Nicole, she just reflexively got into the driver's seat of the car just to make sure that Durante didn't take anything inside of her car that he shouldn't, or mess with her car in some way to get revenge on her. And so she's sitting there, she's watching Durante right next to her, gather up his things, and then he hops out of the car, doesn't say a word to her, and then he walked around the front of her car and got into his car, which was parked right in front of hers, facing out towards the road. He climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door, and then he didn't move. And so Nicole, she's still sitting in her car, looking at Durante, hoping that he's just gonna leave now, but he wasn't. And so suddenly feeling so frustrated and mad at him for everything, she turned on her car and drove forward, not fast or anything, and bumped intentionally into the back of Durante's car, and then she backed up to where she had been. And after she did that, she stared angrily at Durante, basically being like, "What? Like, I want you to leave. Like, get out of here." And Durante, he was furious. And so he threw his car in reverse and he really hit the gas and rammed into the front of Nicole's car. And in fact, he hit her car so hard that her car lurched backwards and smashed into her fence. Now, Nicole's memory only showed her this exchange. She remembered fighting with Durante, him getting his stuff, and then her bumping into him, and then him really hard smashing into her. And so when she thought about the minor accident she had gotten into, this was it. But what Nicole did not know as she was laying in the hospital bed, as this detective is holding up the scan and pointing at it, is there was actually a whole other series of events that played out after Durante backed into her. After Durante backed into Nicole and she smashed into her fence, Durante got out of his car, walked up to Nicole's car, drew a gun, and shot Nicole in the head. That's what happened. This was not a glass cut. This mark on her forehead was where the bullet went into her skull. But obviously, this did not kill Nicole. It knocked her unconscious, and Durante picked her up, put her in his car, and drove her to his mother's house, where he told his mother that, oh, Nicole was drunk and she got into a small accident and, she just needs to rest. And so Durante's mom, believing her son, put some Neosporin on Nicole's entry wound from the gunshot, put a Band-Aid over it, and kind of looked after her for the night. And then when Nicole came to, she had no idea what happened. Her memory only existed up until Durante rammed into her. She didn't remember him getting out and shooting her and all of that. And so when Durante realized that Nicole didn't know he shot her, he just went along with it and said, oh yeah, you got drunk and, we were fighting a little bit and you got into a small accident and I think the glass fell down and cut your head. That's all that happened. And Nicole believed it. It wasn't until Leisha made Nicole go to the hospital 5 weeks later and they scanned her head that they discovered a bullet lodged in her brain. And so the detective came in the room holding up the scan and he pointed to the bright spot on the scan and that was the bullet. And the doctors and nurses, they told Nicole that we've never seen anything like this, like you should be dead. And also because this has gone untreated for 5 weeks, your body healed around the bullet. Like we can't even take it out now. Your brain has formed itself around the bullet. And so it will do more damage than good if we try to pull it out. And so Nicole would go on to live her life with this bullet in her head, but she never really fully recovered. As for Durante, the police would very quickly go after him, but he would flee police and evade them for 2 years. And then finally, when they caught up to him, he was hiding in an attic and there was this whole long standoff. But then finally he would surrender himself and then he would get charged with a host of crimes, many of which he was convicted of, and so ultimately he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. One late night in the summer of 1974, a 30-year-old man named Fred stood inside of a loud casino in Las Vegas, feeling incredibly nervous. He knew what he was about to do was a horrible idea. In fact, he didn't even know if he had the guts to try it. Fred grabbed a huge wad of cash out of his pocket, and as he looked at it, he thought about the reason he was here. So Fred had actually flown to Las Vegas on a whim after a bad meeting with a group of investors. So Fred had founded this small company 3 years earlier, and he really needed a loan from these investors, but they had said no. Fred had actually already lost over $13 million to this point, and so the investors said, look, like your track record is not good enough, we're not giving you any more money. And this was a huge problem for Fred, because right now, in all of his company accounts, he had a total of $5,000. And at a minimum, he needed to pay his fuel bill for his company, which was $24,000. And that bill was due soon, so he didn't have enough money to cover it. And besides the fuel bill, he also didn't have any money to make payroll. So basically, Fred did not have any more money. And if he didn't find a way to find more money, he would have to file for bankruptcy, shut his business down, and lay off all of his employees. And so Fred really couldn't think of a worse fate here. He totally believed in this company. I mean, this was his baby. He'd invested all of his inheritance into it. But now it was about to collapse, unless he got really, really lucky. All around him in the casino, Fred could see gamblers hunched over slot machines and over poker tables and blackjack tables, and some people looked elated, like they were having the time of their lives. And many other people looked like they were maybe having the worst time of their lives and were on the brink of tears. Fred didn't know if he'd be celebrating or sobbing by the end of this night. All he knew is he was out of options here. He could either do nothing and just kind of accept his fate, that his business was doomed and would have to be shut down, or he could do what he was doing tonight, which was to basically take what little cash he had and put it on a game of chance, basically gamble the money he had in hopes of winning enough money to keep his business going a little bit longer. And so after taking a calming breath, Fred began walking over to a blackjack table because someone had told him that of all the games you could play in a Las Vegas casino, the game with the best odds was blackjack. Fred chose a table with an open seat. He exchanged all his cash for chips while he prayed that he was making the right choice here. And then Fred began to play. For the first few hands, Fred was pretty cautious, only placing small bets. But he won all those small bets, and it kind of emboldened him. And so he began placing larger bets, and he began winning those bets too. And in fact, it got to the point where he was winning so consistently that a crowd of strangers had formed behind the table just to watch Fred. But Fred wasn't even aware of the crowd behind him. He was so focused on every single hand. I mean, for him, this was like his life he was gambling with. And eventually, he got to a place where he had like a mountain of chips in front of him, and he was gambling huge sums of it all at once. And then eventually, when he had this big mountain of chips in front of him, Fred decided this was it. He was going to double down and go all in. And so he puts all these chips out and he waits, and eventually the dealer flips over their cards. And as soon as they did, the crowd around Fred, who he hadn't even noticed to this point, erupted in cheers because Fred had just won. And when the dealer pushed all the chips back over to him and he got to count how much money he had, he realized he had started with $5,000, but now had $27,000. He had gambled and won. $27,000 was just enough to pay that fuel bill and keep his company running a little bit longer. So basically exactly what Fred had hoped for had happened. And then during this extra time that Fred had basically won himself, he was able to secure $11 million in investor funding, which was enough money to finally scale up this small business into the behemoth that we know it as today. Fred went from being a guy betting his last chips at a casino to now being a multi-billionaire. Fred's full name is Fred Smith, and that little company that he scaled up on a gamble was FedEx. One evening in the late 1980s, a man in his 20s named Norm walked into a house party in the Hollywood Hills, which is a very exclusive and pricey neighborhood in Los Angeles, California. In this house, which was filled with people, there were all these actors and entertainers and Hollywood-type people, and Norm, who was this kind of scruffy guy with long stringy hair and who had no experience in the entertainment industry, knew he did not fit in here at all. In fact, Norm never would have been at a party like this if not for what had happened to him just a few hours earlier. So that afternoon, Norm had gotten into a fight with his boss at the motorcycle shop where he worked. Now, Norm and his boss never got along, but they managed to coexist for the most part, except today, this small argument had turned into a huge argument that turned into Norm getting fired. And so after getting fired, Norm left the shop and just began aimlessly walking around Los Angeles until he wound up running into one of his friends. And over the course of this conversation where Norm's like, yeah, I got fired, not doing too good, the friend was like, oh, well, tonight there's gonna be this big party up in the Hollywood Hills. Why don't you come along? And Norm, who was feeling admittedly pretty down after being fired, decided, you know what the heck? I'll go to this party because maybe that will boost my spirits. And so now here he was. And so Norm went and found his friend in the house party, and for a little while, the party was pretty great. I mean, Norm felt kind of uncomfortable, didn't really know anybody. It was kind of awkward, but it was fine. Him and his friend were drinking and chatting, and his friend was introducing him to some people, and it was all good. Except Norm just couldn't shake the anger he felt about getting fired. Not only at the fact that he was now unemployed, which was a huge problem, but he also just felt mad at his boss. Like, how dare his boss do this to him? And so to cope with this, Norm just began drinking really heavily, like way more than anybody else at this party. And before long, Norm was completely plastered drunk. But it would turn out, getting totally smashed did not calm Norm down. In fact, if anything, it only made him more blind with rage about what had happened to him. And so naturally what he did is he departs his friend and pushes through the crowd of people, and he goes up to the second floor where there was this balcony that overlooked where basically everybody in the house was. And Norm, who's slurring his speech and he's totally a mess, he screams out to the crowd of these people that he doesn't even know, these Hollywood people, basically screams at them to stop what they're doing and listen to him. And everyone did. They turned around and looked up at this guy like, what's going on here? And Norm just begins delivering this totally angry rant that kind of didn't even make any sense. I mean, he's drunk, but he's basically ranting about how mad he is and this horrible injustice that's been done to him, and just on and on. He's just pouring out all of his emotions, and everybody's just kind of looking at him like, what is going on here? It was like a train wreck, They couldn't look away. Eventually, Norman finished up his big, rambling, humiliating speech, and he stepped away from the railing, and everybody down below who, had been wrapped to this point, but now was kind of like, whatever. They went back to the party, and Norm just stood up there kind of taking in the scene, and suddenly he felt a tap on his shoulder. And he turned around and he saw there was this person he didn't recognize, and this person says to Norm, hey, have you ever considered acting in a play? It would turn out that person was a Hollywood producer, and they were putting on a play in LA. And they really liked Norm's look, the whole kind of scruffy vibe, but even more as they watched him deliver that totally angry, drunken rant that he managed to get all these people to listen to, that it was obvious he had natural charisma and he could command an audience even when the audience had no idea what he was talking about. And so ultimately, this producer literally offered Norm an acting job, and Norm, who really didn't have aspirations to be an actor, but now needed a job because he had just been fired that day, he's unemployed, he agreed. He said, okay, I'll act in your play. And so Norman would act in this play, and he would do such a good job, despite the fact that he totally was not an actor. He literally was a drunk guy at a party who randomly got recognized by some producer. But regardless, he acts in this play, and he is such a natural and does such a good job that he gets noticed by other Hollywood producers and casting directors. And before long, he lands his starring role in the mega hit TV show, The Walking Dead. Norm's full name is Norman Reedus. One evening in the late winter of 1973, a 23-year-old mother named Tabby put her 8-month-old son and 2-year-old daughter down for their naps inside of their double-wide trailer, which was parked in a small town in New England. Once her kids fell asleep, Tabby looked over at the clock. She was waiting for her husband to get home from his job as a high school teacher, and he was running late. Tabby wondered, what could be holding up her husband, and she certainly hoped he was okay, but she couldn't just call the high school to ask how he was doing because they didn't own a landline phone. They literally didn't have enough money to afford a landline phone in their trailer. In fact, they basically only had enough money to barely make ends meet. So Tabby and her husband actually had dreams of becoming professional writers. But they had found over the past few years that breaking into writing at this time in America was nearly impossible. They had gotten a few stories published here and there, but, for the most part, the only thing their writing had gotten them was a whole bunch of rejection. And so as a result of this, both of them had taken day jobs to basically supplement the income that was not being generated from writing. Tabby was home with the kids, and then in the evening would work some shifts at a Dunkin' Donuts. And then her husband, in addition to being a teacher, also worked at a laundromat. But even with their 3 jobs combined, they barely made any money. Now, Tabby still held on to hope that, maybe one day she could break in and be a professional writer and have that be her primary income. But her husband, who also, had the same dream, was over time becoming increasingly more pessimistic about his opportunity to, one day just be a writer. He sort of felt like this truly was impossible, that they'd struggle forever and he wouldn't become a writer. Tabby walked to the tiny laundry room in the back of their trailer to switch their clothes from the washer to the dryer. So this room, the laundry room, actually doubled as her husband's office. And as soon as she walked back there, she saw his desk was a total mess. All around his typewriter, which sat right in the middle of the table, were all these empty beer cans and food wrappers and rejection letters from various magazines and publications. And the trash can next to the table on the ground was overflowing with crumpled up pieces of paper. Feeling very annoyed by this mess, Tabby reached down to tie up the trash bag to take it outside, but as she went to do that, she happened to glance at one of these crumpled up pieces of paper in the trash, and she skimmed a couple of sentences that were written on it, that were typed on this paper. And as soon as she did, she stopped because there was something really interesting about this writing. Now, she knew her husband had written whatever was on this page, but generally speaking, her husband always shared with her anything he had written, and she would read everything. And there was something about this text that she knew she had not read it before. Like, this was different. Clearly he wrote it, but she had not seen this before. And so she was curious. So she pulled the paper out of the trash can and smoothed it off, and actually began reading what turned out to be this failed manuscript that her husband had thrown away. And she couldn't believe how good it was. And so it dawned on Tabby that clearly her husband had been working on this in secret, which made her wonder, like, one, why are you doing that? Why are you hiding this particular thing from me when you let me read everything else? And two, again, this is so good. Why is it crumpled up and in the trash? Just then, Tabby heard the front door of the trailer open and her husband come inside. And so Tabby just took the page she was reading and walked out of the laundry room, and she held it up to her husband and she was like, "What is this? Why haven't you shown me this?" And to Tabby's surprise, her husband, when he realized what she was holding, just looked totally embarrassed, like he wished she hadn't seen that. And she said to him, "No, like, this is so good. What's going on here?" And her husband would tell her, "Look, like, I started writing this thing, I didn't really know what it was going to become, but I quickly realized that I don't know enough about the subject matter, and, I'm just not talented enough to finish the story, and even if I was, like, this is too weird, it's too out there, no one would publish this." And so ultimately, he had just thrown it away and not told Tabby. And in fact, he went on to tell Tabby that in addition to this being a failed project, he really understood at this point in his career that he was a failed writer. And right now, what he really needed to do was give up writing altogether and just focus on making money for the family, something they desperately needed. Tabby could see her husband was completely serious. And so she just held up this piece of paper and she said, "No, this is the one. This is the one that's going to help you break through. I know it. And you know what? Even if you don't know the subject matter, I do. I can help you with that. And together, we can make this a full-length novel. You got to see it through. It's too good not to." And so, at Tabby's insistence, that's what her husband did. He would spend several months working with Tabby to finish this novel, and by the spring of 1974, it was done. And so, that same spring, they began shopping the manuscript around to different publishers, really having no idea how anybody was going to react. But they were both totally blown away when one of the major publishers they sent this thing to came back and said, "Not only will we absolutely print this book, but we'll also give you a $400,000 advance," which in today's money is $2.5 million. A massive, massive book deal by any standard. And so the young couple was totally thrilled. They took the book deal, the book got published, and with the money they got, they were able to move out of their double-wide trailer, and they were able to purchase a landline telephone. But that was only the beginning. Tabby's decision to pull that crumpled up piece of paper out of the trash can and force her husband to turn it into a novel would prove to be a good one, because her husband would go on to become arguably one of the most famous writers in the world. That story, that Tabby saved from the trash can, would go on to become the iconic horror novel Carrie. Tabby's husband was none other than Stephen King. On the afternoon of July 29, 2016, a 23-year-old college student named Felix stood in the break room of the industrial manufacturing company where he worked in northwestern Germany. He poured some cereal into a bowl, and then he took his carton of milk out of the communal fridge, and then with the cereal and his milk, he sat down at a table with two of his coworkers. So Felix was studying to become an engineer, and that was his primary focus. And on his breaks from school, he would work here as a machine mechanic. But as a result of that, basically just being a college kid looking for a side gig, it made him one of the youngest people at this company. And so oftentimes, Felix had a hard time relating to his coworkers, who were all basically a lot older than him. And in fact, now, as he sat down to eat his cereal, the two coworkers that were sitting there already, these two men named Otto and Klaus, who were in their 50s, it's like they didn't even look up and acknowledge him. They just continued silently eating their sandwiches as if Felix wasn't even there. At first, Felix put up with the fact that this lunch break so far was pretty awkward. Like there was no conversation happening here. He definitely felt like he did not belong here. But eventually, the silence was deafening at this table, and Felix just couldn't stand it. And so he said to his coworkers, Klaus and Otto, hey guys, how's the day going? And Klaus looked up and stared at Felix, and he just shrugged, said nothing, and went back to eating his food. Now, Klaus, admittedly, was known as sort of a loner employee who kind of kept to himself, so this behavior was somewhat normal, although somewhat off-putting to Felix, who's trying to obviously start a conversation here. But then Otto, he looked up, and he looked at Felix, and he was about to say something, but then paused, and this grimace came over his face, and he just said to Felix, you know what? I'm not having a good day. My head hurts, my stomach hurts, I feel tired, I feel kind of awful. And so now Felix is like, okay, sorry, Otto, I don't know what to tell you, that's tough. And then the three men just kind of went back to eating and back to silence. Now, Felix didn't know how to make this any less awkward, and so he just went back to eating his cereal in silence, and then when he was done, he got up and left the awkward break room. But Felix had only been back to his job for a couple of minutes when suddenly he felt this intense stomach cramp that made him double over in pain. Now, Felix actually was somewhat accustomed to getting cramps like this one because he was lactose intolerant. And typically, if he consumed dairy shortly thereafter, he would get these stabbing pains in his stomach. That's actually why he kept a carton of his own milk in the communal fridge that was lactose-free. And so suddenly, Felix wondered if maybe he had accidentally grabbed the wrong milk when he had poured his cereal just now. Had he grabbed regular milk, causing this pain? And so as a wave of nausea came over him, Felix sprinted back into the break room, opened up the communal fridge to see if he had grabbed the wrong milk, but he saw there was actually only one container of milk in the fridge, and it was his, the lactose-free kind. And so he had no idea what was actually causing these cramps because it couldn't have been dairy. But at this point, Felix was just so nauseous that all he could think about now was the fact that he could no longer work today. He had to go home. And so Felix told his supervisor he had to go, and then he rushed out to his car, he sped home, and barely made it into his bathroom in time in order to vomit into the toilet. And after he vomited, he felt a little bit better, and so he wiped his mouth, and he stood up straight, took a deep breath, and then he went to the sink and he splashed some water on his face, and he grabbed the towel and he went to dry his face, and as he did, he noticed something. He noticed the tips of his fingers were now tingling, like his hands were going numb. And so reflexively, he put down the hand towel and began flexing and opening and closing his hands over and over again to increase the circulation to his fingers, to maybe get the feeling back, but nothing he did seemed to help. And at this point, Felix couldn't help but feel a little bit scared. Now, stomach cramps and nausea were somewhat normal symptoms for him, considering, again, he was lactose intolerant. Those were normal symptoms of illness. But losing circulation in your hands was not something he was used to. This was something else. And so even though Felix was an adult, he was 23 years old, his first thought was, I gotta call my mom. And so that's what he did. 2 weeks later, Felix was still sick. On his mother's advice, he had gone to see his doctor, and his doctor had told him that he was very likely just overworked, and he prescribed Felix some vitamins and rest. But those two things had not helped Felix. In fact, really, his symptoms had only gotten worse. He was still nauseous, and that tingling feeling he had felt in his hands had now extended all the way up into his forearms. And so as a result of this mystery illness afflicting Felix, he had not been able to go back to work, and he had spent the better part of the last 2 weeks just lying miserably in bed. But this morning, he was determined to get out of bed, take a shower, have a real meal, and basically just have a normal day. And so it started relatively well. He managed to, prop himself up and get out of bed. But as he staggered his way towards the bathroom, he lost his balance and had to grab onto the door to keep from falling to the ground. After steadying himself, Felix did attempt to keep walking towards the bathroom, but it was like the commands from his brain were not reaching his legs. And so he kept slipping and staggering and almost falling. And so eventually he just turned around to go back to bed, but immediately he kind of collapsed to the ground and had to literally crawl painstakingly back to the bed. And then when he had finally pulled himself back on there, he pulled out his phone and called his mom again. But this time, he was not calling for advice. He was calling for help. He needed her to drive him to the hospital. Later that afternoon, Felix laid in a hospital bed with his mother to his left and an emergency room neurologist to his right. The neurologist had heard about Felix's symptoms, and she was now performing a preliminary examination, which really consisted of lots of questions about Felix's drug use, about, a history of neurological problems in their family, had he had any recent head injuries. But basically all the questions she was asking him, he said no to. There weren't any precursors to him having these issues. Next, the neurologist poked Felix's arms to see what he could feel, because he was complaining of numbness and tingling. But it was kind of like wherever she poked in his arms, he couldn't really feel it. It was like the tingling sensation had totally taken over both arms. That's all he could feel. After that, she measured his muscle reflexes in his legs and also shined a light in both his eyes. And then after that, she put her tools down and she looked at Felix with a very worried expression on her face. She said that based on Felix's symptoms, she thought that some part of his nervous system, like his brain or his spinal cord, might be inflamed. And this type of inflammation can lead to things like nausea, numbness, and loss of coordination, all things Felix had been experiencing. And this inflammation could be caused by a number of different infections or an autoimmune reaction. But to know for sure, she would have to run some more tests. And so she advised Felix to be admitted to the hospital. 6 days later, the neurologist went to check in on Felix, who was still at the hospital. And as soon as she walked into his room and saw Felix, she saw he looked terrible. His body was limp, his face was swollen, and his eyes were sort of glazed over, like he was staring off into the distance. By this point, doctors had run imaging scans on Felix and had discovered that his brain and brainstem were inflamed, like the neurologist had suspected. But the neurologist could not figure out why this was happening. Typically, inflammation like this was caused by an infection. But the neurologist had tested Felix for every infection she could think of that could have caused this, and all those tests had come back negative. So her new working theory was Felix must be having an extreme autoimmune reaction, which is basically when your immune system malfunctions and starts attacking your own body. Autoimmune reactions can cause things like brain swelling. But this theory didn't really help Felix very much, because first of all, it was nearly impossible to test to see if this theory was even true, that it was an autoimmune reaction. And second of all, even if you knew that's what it was, unfortunately, autoimmune reactions are notoriously difficult to treat. Basically, it was a shaky diagnosis that did not come with an easy cure. The neurologist had given Felix some anti-inflammatory medication, hoping that maybe that would help, based on her research around autoimmune diseases, but it basically did nothing. And she knew that if she didn't find a way to lower the swelling in his brain and brainstem, that Felix could potentially suffer permanent brain damage or even death. So now, in Felix's hospital room, the neurologist walked over to him and tapped his shoulder, and she asked him how he was feeling. And Felix, when he sort of looked up at her, his eyes were rolled back in his skull, and it took a minute for him to focus on her. And then it was clear to the neurologist that it took all of his energy to croak out an answer. But the words he said didn't make any sense. He said, metal, mouth. And the neurologist said, what? Like, what are you trying to say? And then he said, taste, water. And at that point, the neurologist realized what Felix was trying to say is that he had a metallic taste in his mouth and he wanted a cup of water to clear his mouth. The neurologist felt like this had to be a clue about what was going on with Felix. It was not some random symptom, like this has to be connected to the totality of what was wrong with him. But she didn't know what a metallic taste in his mouth had to do with his other symptoms. And so she was baffled. So she just grabbed a cup of water off the nearby table and handed it to Felix. And Felix immediately put it to his lips and tried to drink it. But it was like he couldn't, and the water just dribbled down his chin onto his chest. And as the neurologist stared at her patient, she couldn't help but feel like she was just totally failing here. I mean, obviously there was something horribly wrong with Felix, but she had not come up with a proper diagnosis yet. And all the medications and treatments she had suggested so far had done nothing for his symptoms. And she knew if she couldn't get the swelling to go down, it was just a matter of time before he suffered permanent brain damage or death. And so at this point, the neurologist realized a big change would have to be made in Felix's care. Clearly what she was doing was not working. And so she decided to transfer him from her hospital to a local university hospital where she knew there were some specialists there who they might be able to figure out what was going on here. But the next day at that university hospital, that team of specialists that had been assigned to Felix's case were just as baffled as the neurologist had been. Because now Felix didn't just have swelling in his brain and a metallic taste in his mouth. He also was experiencing kidney and liver failure. And this collection of symptoms meant Felix very likely did not have an autoimmune condition. They tested him again for more infections that, maybe could still leave the possibility open that it was an autoimmune condition. But again, those still all came back negative. And so effectively, these specialists who were here to, solve this puzzle were back at square one. They had made no further progress. And so at this point, all Felix's doctors could do was just hope that whatever illness was plaguing Felix would sort of resolve itself on its own. And they would just, do their best to manage his symptoms and try to keep him comfortable until it did. However, by September of 2016, so 2 months after that first day that Felix went home sick from work, he had not improved. He spent most of his time laying in bed unconscious, barely clinging to life. At this point, most of these specialists were just monitoring Felix. However, one of them still felt like a diagnosis here was still possible. We just need to keep looking. And so this doctor actually decided that instead of monitoring Felix, he was going to start looking into some medical research papers because he figured, whatever Felix had to be really, really rare. If it wasn't, they would have figured it out by now, and they clearly had not. So he must have something rare. And if there's one place you can go to learn about very rare conditions and diseases, it's medical research papers. And so he began combing through all these papers, and sure enough, he would actually find a case about another patient who had the exact same symptoms as Felix, and they even appeared in the exact same order. First, the stomach cramps and nausea, followed by the tingling in the arms, then the loss of coordination in the legs, then the swelling of the brain, followed by the metallic taste in the mouth, and then ultimately kidney and liver failure. And just like Felix, this patient's diagnosis in this medical journal was not an infection, nor was it an autoimmune disease. Instead, it was a condition that was so rare, it had only been recorded 3 times anywhere in the world over the last century. But this doctor understood that even though Felix's symptoms did appear to match, it still was highly unlikely he actually had this diagnosis because it's so unbelievably rare. However, the doctor thought, well, I'll just rule this condition out. All I need to do is a simple blood test. And so he did this blood test on Felix, literally believing it would just rule this out, except when the results came back, it was positive. This doctor had just solved the case, the one that nobody else seemed able to do. But the doctor was not happy. Instead, as he stared at the test results, he was kind of horrified because this diagnosis was a death sentence for Felix. There was no cure for this. And worse, this diagnosis meant other people potentially could be in danger here. And so the doctor knew his next step, of course, would be to contact Felix's family and tell them what he had discovered. But he also knew this was no longer just a medical problem. The doctor called local law enforcement, and they began their investigation immediately. They interviewed basically everyone Felix ever interacted with on a regular basis, and they also sent forensic technicians to all the places that Felix spent any time. And these technicians ran tests on all the surfaces that Felix might have touched at one point or another. They also ran tests on the food and the water that he might have consumed. They even at one point tried to test the air that Felix had potentially breathed. And they did all this because they were trying to find one very specific substance. But despite basically looking everywhere in Felix's life for weeks and weeks, they didn't find it. Meanwhile, Felix's condition only got worse. By the end of September, he had slipped into a vegetative state. But at least so far, the doctor's worst fears had not been realized. They actually expected other people to begin to turn up to hospitals with similar symptoms as Felix. But they hadn't. So, with no answers, but with no other victims either, the police investigation began to wind down. Felix remained in a vegetative state for months and then years, and officials still just had no idea how this actually happened to him. They just kind of concluded that, well, this was a horrible tragedy that very likely will never actually be explained. But at least hopefully it will never happen to anyone else. But then, 2 years after Felix fell into his coma, some very strange things began to happen at his old manufacturing job. So at this manufacturing company where Felix used to work, it actually was pretty commonplace for employees there to get sick fairly regularly, like more than normal. However, their illnesses were sort of basic. Things like headaches and stomach aches and feeling sort of tired. Things that didn't really raise big red flags. But now, Otto, the middle-aged man who had complained to Felix over their lunch break about his stomach and his head hurting, was going into kidney failure. And in fact, he was so sick he couldn't come to work anymore and had to get dialysis 3 times a week just to live. And also, another much younger employee, whose name was Elias, he was 26 years old, he had begun having stomach aches. Now, again, that was fairly common at this company, but for Elias, these were not normal stomach aches. These were crippling, severe, like you can't focus on anything else type of stomach aches, similar to the ones Felix was having. Now, Otto and Elias had not spoken to each other about their respective illnesses. This was a place where people just kind of got sick periodically and kept it to themselves. It was just not really that big of a deal. So they hadn't talked to each other, and they certainly had not connected what was happening to them to Felix and his illness, which was now over 2 years before. But that would all change one day in May of 2018, so again, we're still talking about 2 years since Felix went into his coma, when Elias was having his lunch in the company break room, and he would discover something that would connect everything and blow this case wide open. Elias's shocking discovery led police to do a search of a local home. And at first, this home seemed totally ordinary until they went down into the basement. Because down there, it looked like a mad scientist's laboratory. There was this metal table with all these beakers and scales on it, and then behind it were all these shelves that were stacked high with old jam jars and paint cans and even old mayonnaise bottles. And it would turn out, inside of these mismatched containers was a collection of deadly chemicals that a judge would later say were more toxic and more deadly than the literal chemical weapons that were used during World War I. This basement laboratory belonged to Klaus. He was one of the 2 employees that Felix sat with during that very awkward lunch break. The one was Otto, who told Felix he didn't feel very good, and the other was Klaus, the man who, when asked how his day was going, just looked up at Felix, shrugged his shoulders, and said nothing. It would turn out, for years, Klaus had been buying deadly chemicals online, mixing them together, and then sort of testing these concoctions on his coworkers. He would just poison their lunches and see what happened. Felix's very rare disease that only 3 people had experienced in the past century in the whole world was effectively extremely acute mercury poisoning. Basically, an ungodly high level of mercury poisoning. Because Klaus was literally just putting mercury into Felix's cereal, and he was just eating it up. In addition to poisoning Felix's cereal, Klaus also put lead literally right on top of Elias's sandwiches, and then he also put a combination of lead and cadmium into Otto's food. Klaus was only caught because Elias made that big discovery. While he was eating his lunch, he noticed there was a strange powder sitting on top of his sandwich, and so he called the police. Klaus never explained his motives for the poisonings. In March of 2019, he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. And unfortunately, 10 months after that, Felix, who had been in a vegetative state for 3 years to that point, passed away. As for Elias and Otto, they still suffer from long-term effects of chemical poisoning. Josie Baker smiled as she watched her 4-year-old daughter, Lila, hunt for frogs near the stream behind their house. Josie's other daughter, 1-year-old Adelaide, gripped her mother's hand as she wobbled forward to see what her big sister was up to. On this sunny afternoon in late March of 2021, the 24-year-old mother felt like her dreams were actually coming true. Just over a year ago, Josie had moved into this small house in the farmlands north of Dallas, Texas, with her family. They all loved the fresh air and wide open space, and little Lila had become close friends with the cows that grazed in the pasture next door. Josie shared her daughter's love of animals. She actually worked as a veterinary assistant in a local animal hospital, and the family had even taken in a pet raccoon named Jinx. Josie checked her watch and realized her husband, Dustin, would be home soon from his job as a firefighter and paramedic, and so she needed to start fixing dinner. She called out to Lila and scooped up baby Adelaide. Then the whole crew headed for the back door of their house. But the moment Josie stepped inside the house, she was overwhelmed by a strong floral smell, like someone nearby was wearing way too much perfume. Josie held her nose and peeked inside the kitchen, and it was a total mess. Cabinet doors were wide open, and it looked like the food inside had been hurled across the room. Boxes of cereal and bags of chips were ripped open and spilled all over the counter and the floor. The cabinet under the kitchen sink was also open, and broken bottles of dishwashing detergent and other cleaning supplies were spread out all over the place. And when Josie looked closely, she saw something else. Tiny animal footprints tracking the mess out of the room. Now, Josie knew exactly what had happened to her kitchen. Jinx, their raccoon, had ransacked it. Jinx was supposed to live in an enclosure in the living room, but clearly he'd escaped and decided to have some fun in the kitchen. Josie ultimately found Jinx hiding under the bed in Lila's bedroom, and while she was mad, she couldn't really stay mad at him as he stared out at her with his little black cute eyes. And so Josie coaxed him out with some food before picking him up and returning him to his pen. As she swept up the broken glass in the kitchen, Josie felt like she actually had kind of dodged a bullet here. Because, this could have been a whole lot worse if maybe her girls had come into the house ahead of her and maybe got cut on all the shards of glass lying around. And so as she dumped the trash into a wastebasket, she had to admit to herself that all in all, the whole scene in front of her was actually kind of funny. While the house may be a total mess and a total pain to clean up, one thing was certain. Their little raccoon Jinx, after breaking into all the cleaning supplies, was now the sweetest smelling raccoon in the state of Texas. 2 weeks later, after tucking in the girls for the night, Josie walked back out to the living room to snuggle up on the couch with her husband Dustin. But when she stepped into the room, she found Dustin standing in the corner, staring into Jinx's enclosure. Josie was curious, and so she walked over to see what he was looking at, and when she looked down, she gasped. Jinx was acting so weird. The raccoon swayed and staggered as he walked around his enclosure, almost like he was drunk. He also kept bumping into objects and walls, which made Josie think maybe his vision was impaired. Because of her job as a veterinary technician, Josie had been around plenty of sick animals, but Jinx's condition was something she'd actually never seen before in any other animal. So she told Dustin that she would bring Jinx with her to the animal hospital first thing in the morning. The next morning, Josie stood by while one of the vets at her hospital examined her raccoon. But after a few minutes, the vet turned to Josie and admitted that they too were totally stumped by whatever was bothering Jinx. They didn't understand what it was. Josie agreed that the best course of action now would be to keep Jinx under observation at the hospital and run some additional tests. But over the course of his stay, nothing the veterinarians did seemed to help Jinx, and in fact, Jinx just seemed to get sicker and sicker until he basically just lay in his cage, panting with his tongue out. And then 2 days after he had come to the hospital, Jinx died. Josie was devastated, but she was far more concerned about how her daughter Lila would react to Jinx's passing. She was going to be absolutely heartbroken. The day after Jinx's death, the Baker family walked solemnly down the path behind their house towards the stream, and they buried Jinx under a tree. At the end of the service, Josie kneeled down and helped a very sad Lila plant flowers atop her beloved pet's final resting place. A few weeks later, on the afternoon of May 29th, Josie sat on her living room couch right next to Lila, who for the past couple of days had been vomiting and running a fever. Her pediatrician had said that it was probably just the stomach flu and recommended rest and fluids. So Josie had pulled together all these pillows and blankets and put them on the couch to let her daughter relax and watch TV while she recuperated. However, as Josie looked at her sleeping daughter beside her, she felt increasingly worried. Josie had been carefully following the doctor's instructions, but Lila's fever really hadn't broken yet, and she was still struggling to keep her food down. Lila had been sleeping for a couple of hours now, so Josie gently placed her hand on Lila's forehead and whispered to her to wake up so she could drink some water. But as Lila slowly opened her eyes, Josie could see that they looked glazed over and unfocused. Josie tried to help Lila sit up, but the little girl could barely lift her head. Josie immediately wrapped her daughter in a blanket and carried her to the car. Her barely conscious 4-year-old needed to see a doctor right away. Later that day, Josie climbed out of an ambulance outside of the Children's Hospital in Dallas, Texas, while orderlies ran to help unload Lila from the back. The doctor at their local hospital, where Josie had gone first, had told Josie that based on her daughter's condition, this local hospital could not help her. They needed specialized care. So Lila had been rushed in an ambulance to a major pediatric hospital instead. Once Lila was unloaded from the ambulance, she was immediately taken up to the intensive care unit. At the same time, a doctor named Catherine Merrill met with Josie in the hallway to explain what they were going to do to treat her daughter. Dr. Merrill said that Lila's white blood cell count was very high, which was a strong indicator that Lila was fighting off an infection. Josie listened carefully as the doctor laid out the range of tests they planned to run to try to figure out where this infection came from and where it was located in Lila's body. Dr. Merrill also explained that while the testing was in progress, they would also be administering antibiotics to Lila to help her fight off whatever this infection was. As they talked, Josie could hear her daughter throwing up again, so Josie quickly thanked the doctor and rushed back to her daughter's bedside. Over the next couple of days, the doctors and nurses and medical team ran dozens of tests on Lila, but unfortunately, the results of those tests didn't really tell them anything. All the tests could confirm was that whatever was going on with Lila was not one of the common suspects, like bacterial meningitis or a foodborne disease like salmonella. And as each test came back basically showing nothing, Dr. Merrill became more and more confused. Meanwhile, Lila's condition grew even worse. Her frequent vomiting caused her to have trouble breathing, which led to low oxygen levels in her blood. So Dr. Merrill decided to insert a breathing tube through Lila's nose and down her windpipe, requiring the little girl to be heavily sedated. Lila's illness consumed the entire family, as first Josie and then Dustin took leave from their jobs so they could spend more time at the hospital with their girl. But day after day, no new information came in, and Lila kept getting worse. Not only was she completely incapable of holding her head up now, she couldn't even walk or speak. And so it wasn't long before Josie and Dustin began to fear the worst, that they might never get their sweet, energetic 4-year-old back. One night in June, nearly 2 weeks after Lila got sick, Dr. Merrill entered Lila's hospital room and found her parents at her bedside as usual. After giving Lila an extensive examination, Dr. Merrill thought that this infection was actually attacking Lila's brain and nervous system. In order to find out for sure, Lila's doctors would perform a brain biopsy, which meant they would cut a small opening in Lila's skull to acquire tiny samples of her brain tissue. Josie thought that sounded like a very intense operation for such a young girl in such a weakened state already, but the brain biopsy was also their best remaining hope to find out what was going on with her. So Josie and Dustin looked at each other for a moment, and it was clear they both understood they didn't really have a choice here. They had to do this, so they told Dr. Merrill to go ahead with the procedure. A few days later, Josie sat by Lila's hospital bed and read to her from her favorite book, while Dustin napped nearby in a chair. Lila was still not able to speak or walk, but she had made it through the brain biopsy just fine and was actually starting to show small signs of improvement. And so Josie was actually feeling optimistic for the first time in a while. But moments later, Dr. Merrill entered and pulled up a chair to speak with the parents. The results had come back from the brain biopsy, and there was finally an answer to what was ailing their daughter. But the answer was not a good one. Dr. Merrill said that Lila was suffering from a rare and potentially deadly bacterial infection known as melioidosis. The doctor explained that once this bacteria invades a person's system, it causes pus-filled abscesses in whatever tissue it reaches, which is why nearly 40% of melioidosis patients die. And in Lila's case, the bacteria had entered her brain and nervous system, which was why she was having so much trouble moving and speaking, and seemed very disoriented. All of this was obviously totally devastating to Josie and Dustin, but the doctor told the very upset parents that there actually was reason for hope. Now that they actually knew which bacteria was making their daughter sick, they could give her the right antibiotics to help Lila try to defeat the infection once and for all. 2 weeks after Lila's brain biopsy, a woman in her 20s named Julia Petrus arrived at the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short, in Atlanta, Georgia, for her first day as an epidemic intelligence officer. For years, Julia had worked as a nurse, providing health services to refugees in Bangladesh and Uganda. More recently, she provided medical care for homeless people in Santa Barbara, California, in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. And now she was excited to take on a new challenge. As an epidemic intelligence officer, Julia was now basically a disease detective who would investigate mysterious outbreaks and do her best to prevent the spread of infections. As Julia sat down at her desk and checked her email inbox for the first time, she could see that she was already invited to a Zoom meeting that was starting in just a few minutes. CDC officials would be briefing the FBI about a recent outbreak of melioidosis, a very rare bacterial infection. Julia was familiar with melioidosis, but she didn't understand why this disease would involve the FBI, an agency that investigates crimes. But regardless, moments later, Julia clicked the link on her calendar and logged into the Zoom meeting. After a quick round of introductions, a CDC official began the briefing with a discussion of the case of 4-year-old Lila Baker, who was still in the Dallas Children's Hospital suffering from melioidosis. Julia also learned from this meeting that 2 other cases of melioidosis had been reported in the US in the last 4 months. There was a woman in Kansas who died 9 days after being admitted to the hospital, and a man in Minnesota who was still fighting his symptoms. But there was something strange about all 3 of these cases. Melioidosis was caused by a bacteria that, for all intents and purposes, did not exist in the United States. The bacteria was mostly found in Southeast Asia and Northern Australia. Usually, the only way a person in the United States got melioidosis was by traveling to a region of the world where the bacteria was present. But none of these 3 patients had traveled outside the United States anytime recently. Julia could understand why the CDC wanted to get to the bottom of this mystery. It obviously was in their purview, but she still wasn't sure why the FBI was on this call with them. And it was at this point that one of her colleagues reminded the other attendees on the meeting that this bacteria was so toxic that it was classified as a Tier 1 select agent, and the federal government viewed it as a potential weapon if it got into the wrong hands. And so at this point, the official said the CDC could not rule out the possibility that this melioidosis bacteria had been released into the United States intentionally. Meaning this could potentially be an act of bioterrorism, which is why the FBI was now being briefed up on the situation. Julia was absolutely shocked at this revelation. This was quite an assignment for her first day on the job, and it wasn't even lunchtime. Before her wild first day at the CDC was over, Julia had ordered DNA analysis from the bacteria that was collected from the 3 patients. And within days, the results confirmed exactly what the CDC had feared. The 3 samples were genetically identical, meaning they had all come from the same place. And further investigation revealed to Julia and her colleagues that this particular strain of bacteria could be traced to southern Asia. Julia's next question was, how did the bacteria move all the way from Asia to 3 separate households in the United States? Had it come here on an infected plant or animal, in soil, or a commercial product? Or could it actually have been spread by a bioterrorist who just wanted to hurt people? There were literally thousands of possibilities, and Julia knew that the only way to narrow them down was to find out what the 3 victim households had in common. So she picked up the phone and started calling all the families of the victims. She needed to let them know that the CDC was going to go to their homes and search them. A few days later, Julia drove through the wide-open farmlands of northern Texas on her way to the home of the Baker family. The day before, she had spoken with Josie and Dustin Baker about the need for her to come and collect samples from their property. Other CDC officers were going to scour the homes of the patients from Kansas and Minnesota with the same goal: finding melioidosis bacteria. As Julia pulled her car into the gravel driveway in front of the Baker's home, a woman came out and introduced herself as Josie's sister. She said that Josie and Dustin were still at the hospital with Lila, but she was here now to let Julia know that she had free rein to collect whatever material she thought was relevant to her investigation. Julia thanked her, then started searching every inch of the Baker property for anything that looked like it could have come from Asia. She collected samples of food and cleaning products and placed them in plastic bags. Then she scraped algae from an empty aquarium she found behind the house, since there had been cases where imported tropical fish carried the deadly bacteria. Finally, Julia took soil samples from the bank of the stream near the house, as well as from the plants. As Julia waved to the sister and drove away from the Baker's home, she felt she had been very thorough in her investigation. Although she was still new to this job, she felt like it was very possible to her that the bacteria they were looking for was hidden inside one of the bags and bottles in the trunk of her car right now. A couple of weeks later, in late July, Julia sat in a conference room with the other CDC investigators on her team. Julia scrolled through the pages of laboratory results on her laptop, but she admitted to her colleagues that she was totally stumped. Investigators had gathered hundreds of samples from the 3 locations where people got sick, but none of them contained any trace of the bacteria. But before Julia could start to discuss next steps, one of her colleagues cleared his throat and asked for everyone's attention. Then he read out loud from an email that had just come in on his phone. And as he read, Julia grew even more troubled. The CDC had just gotten word of a 4th case of melioidosis. This one was in Georgia. The patient was a 5-year-old boy who, like the other 3 patients, had never traveled to any region of the world where this bacteria was present. DNA analysis showed that the bacteria that infected him was identical to the samples from the other 3 patients. So he'd most likely gotten it from the same source as all the other patients. Julia closed her eyes as she thought about this new information. The news from Georgia was obviously distressing, but the fact that only one new case had emerged over the course of the last month was probably good news. If terrorists were trying to use the bacteria as a weapon, wouldn't there be many more victims by now? Julia was beginning to think that this outbreak couldn't be an act of bioterrorism. But if this outbreak wasn't bioterrorism, then what was it? Something was causing people to get sick all across the country, and the CDC had no idea what it was. As Julia walked back to her office, lost in thought, she suddenly felt resolved. Their investigation had indeed been thorough and comprehensive, but clearly they had to do more. A few weeks later, on a warm evening in the middle of August 2021, Josie Baker stood by Lila as her daughter's wheelchair was lowered from a van to the ground outside their home. Friends and family were gathered by the front door, clapping and cheering. After 2.5 months in the hospital, Lila was finally home. Josie was overwhelmed with emotion as she carefully pushed her daughter up a ramp that had been installed outside their house just a week prior. Lila's physical condition had stabilized and she was now breathing on her own. But as Josie watched Dustin lift Lila out of her wheelchair and gently lay her on her bed, Josie also knew that there was a long and challenging road ahead of them. Lila had still not regained her ability to speak or walk. Even holding her head upright continued to be a challenge. Josie had to accept a painful truth. there was a good possibility that her daughter had suffered permanent damage to her nervous system. And Josie had another worry. She still had no idea how or where Lila had picked up the bacteria. CDC investigators had not found the bacteria on their property, but it still seemed possible to Josie that it could still be lurking somewhere in their house. So she couldn't shake the idea that if they continued to live in this house, at some point, somebody else in the family was going to get this disease as well. Later that same month, in one of the conference rooms for the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Julia picked up a dry erase pen and started drawing on a whiteboard. Julia had been on the case for almost 2 months, and the agency still had no clue how the 4 patients had contracted this bacteria. Julia knew time was running out to solve this puzzle. The more time passed, the greater the chance that the source of the bacteria might be spread to other locations. So Julia thought, maybe if she just wrote down everything they knew on this whiteboard, that maybe somehow it would help her connect all the dots. Julia's colleagues watched as she divided the board into 4 columns, one for each of the patients. Under each column, Julia listed key details, including dates, medical symptoms, and environmental factors that could be relevant. As the board began to fill up, the team searched for any common factors that could help narrow their search for the source of the bacteria. At some point, Julia had written a ton on this board and just stepped back and looked at it. And when she did, she saw it. 3 of the 4 patients showed signs that the infection had entered their brains, including the patients in Texas, Georgia, and Minnesota. Julia realized that this common thread could be an important clue as to how the bacteria entered the bodies of these patients. If their brains were infected, the bacteria most likely entered their body through their noses rather than through a cut or something they ate or drank, because the quickest route to the brain was through the nasal cavity, meaning there was a very good chance that in all of these cases, the bacteria was somehow inhaled. Julia felt re-energized. Even though CDC investigators had now made multiple trips to the victims' homes to collect samples, Julia knew, now that they had this information about inhaling the bacteria, that they would have to visit all of them one more time. Minutes later, Julia left and headed back to her apartment and began to pack her suitcase. Over the weeks that followed, Julia and her colleagues returned to the homes of all 4 patients and retrieved more samples for testing. They collected anything and everything they could find that could possibly be inhaled, regardless of whether it could have come from Asia. Julia and her colleagues knew they were ultimately searching for a needle in a haystack, but they had to try. And so by September, Julia and the rest of the CDC team had sent hundreds of additional specimens to their laboratory for analysis. And finally, in October of 2021, Julia received a call from a microbiologist who was assigned to this case. The search was finally over. A sample retrieved from the Georgia site contained traces of the melioidosis bacteria. And so after hearing this, it didn't take long for Julia and her team to figure out how the bacteria actually made the trip from Asia to America, causing 4 Americans to be attacked by a bacteria so toxic that the government considered it a potential bioweapon. But in the case of 4-year-old Lila Baker, the spread of the bacteria actually got an assist from a very unusual accomplice. Seven months earlier, in March of 2021, while Josie was watching Lila hunt for frogs near the stream behind their house, the family's beloved pet raccoon, Jinx, was busy ransacking their kitchen. Jinx was on a hunt for food, and he had made a huge mess as he opened every cabinet and drawer, ripping open boxes and bags in search of a tasty snack. Jinx eventually climbed onto the counter near the sink, and he saw a small bottle of liquid. The raccoon soon knocked the bottle off the counter, causing it to break open and spill onto the kitchen floor, releasing that very strong floral aroma into the kitchen. And then when Josie and the kids entered the house, Jinx made a run for it, hopping into that puddle and tracking that floral-smelling liquid throughout the house as he ran away to hide. The bottle that Jinx knocked off the shelf was a United States branded product that Josie bought at Walmart a few weeks earlier. And that same product had been purchased by all 4 of the households that had been struck by melioidosis. What Josie and the other families did not realize
is that while they had all bought this American product at a local American store, it was actually manufactured and bottled at a factory near the southern tip of India. The bacteria that causes melioidosis was known to thrive in the wetter environments of this particular region of India. And somehow, in the process of manufacturing thousands of bottles of this air freshener, known as Better Homes and Gardens Lavender and Chamomile Essential Oil Infused Aromatherapy Room Spray, the bacteria got into the liquid inside. The bottles were then shipped to Walmart stores all across the United States. When customers used the product inside their home, particles of the melioidosis bacteria were sprayed into the air, where they were all inhaled by the people who lived there. Now, most of the people who inhaled the bacteria were healthy enough to fight off the bacteria, and they did not get seriously ill, but the victims in Kansas and Minnesota had other conditions that made them more vulnerable to this infection. And Lila and the young boy in Georgia were just so young that their immature immune systems were unable to fight off the bacteria before serious damage was done to their bodies. As soon as the source of this bacteria was identified, the CDC alerted Walmart, and Walmart quickly discontinued sale of the product and withdrew it from the market. Consumers who purchased the spray were told not to throw it away or pour it down the drain, since that could increase the risk of spreading the bacteria. Instead, they were directed to put the bottle inside of 2 Ziploc bags, then place it inside of a cardboard box, and then physically return it to a Walmart store. But that was not quite the end of this story. CDC investigator Julia Petrus eventually learned of a 5th potential victim of this strain of the melioidosis bacteria. Jinx, the Baker family's beloved pet raccoon, who died shortly after breaking the bottle that contained the contaminated air freshener. Julia hated the idea of disturbing Jinx's grave in the Baker's backyard, but there was a chance that the melioidosis bacteria had actually spread into the environment after he was buried. And so, on April 19, 2022, Julia and other CDC officials returned to the Baker's home in Texas and dug up Jinx's body. But after doing some analysis, Julia and the Baker family were relieved to discover that although Jinx had died of melioidosis, no additional bacteria was detected in the soil or vegetation surrounding Jinx's grave. As of late 2023, Lila Baker has not regained her ability to speak or walk. Josie quit her job at the animal hospital and devoted herself full-time to the care of her daughter. Sadly, the little boy in Georgia died from the infection. However, the other 2 human patients did make full recoveries. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Matt Olmos. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen, and our managing producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Bytak and Tasia Peliconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating